All right, so today we are looking at the foot and ankle complex. We're going to go over all of the kinesiology sort of associated with that. You know, this is our foundation for everything, right? So we kind of talked a little bit about it the other day when we were like, you know, it's your foundation. Like your knee joint is trapped between like the hip and the foot and ankle. If your ankle is dysfunctional, your knees and your hips are probably going to be dysfunctional. You know, it's like if the bottom of the Jenga stack is out of alignment, then the rest of it's going to be out of alignment, you know. So that's one of the things that we really want to pay very, very close attention to. I would say ankle dysfunction, probably the number one thing we see. You know, for instance, you could see somebody with a really good static posture, and then all of a sudden, you know, they start doing something a little bit more dynamic, and then we see that the ankles are a little tight, and it's causing people to move a little bit differently. And so we definitely want to be able to spot this very easily, and understanding that anatomy is going to make it even easier. So we've got 26 bones in our foot and ankle complex, 19 very large muscles that are kind of controlling the whole thing, and then a way more like intrinsic muscles, you know, like these little tiny ones that I could not tell you the name of, like all these little itty bitty ones, and like more than 100 ligaments. This is kind of fun because like there's so many joints in the foot and ankle, you know, because it is a whole bunch of like cube shaped bones all coming together. You know, you can see this bone here, it's got 4 joints, you know, like 1, 2, 3, 4, all on different sides. So with that, there's going to be a whole bunch of ligaments like holding the thing together. So it's a very, very interesting section of our skeletal system. You know, 26 little bones in this whole area. Fun fact, when I was a kid, I actually broke 22 of them. Or at least I had 22 fractures. That's maybe not necessarily all 26 bones, but yeah, I remember I jumped out of a tree when I was a little kid and just completely liquidized my foot. And I remember sitting in the doctor's office, and I was just young enough to pay attention, or just old enough to pay attention. But my mom was like, "Is he gonna be okay? Like it looks so bad." And he's like, "Meh, kids are like taffy, they're fine." And like that was a quote. I was like, okay. So it does a lot for us, right? It does a lot for us. We do know that foot trouble is very, very common. We see lots of foot and ankle complex issues, you know, everything from ankle sprains, which is probably the most common, to things like plantar fasciitis or, you know, bunions even. And so really when it comes down to it, it is probably one of the most important areas that we really do want to be strong inside the body, and we want to make sure we have like proper mechanics. The problem with the foot and ankle complex, where we really start to see a lot of problems, is when the foot tends to be like way too rigid and it doesn't pronate the way it's supposed to, which is very interesting because we actually see too much pronation in most people. Like the most common ankle distortion we see is where people are actually doing too much pronation. And what that shows us is that like it actually basically is staying in pronation when it's like in sync with the ground. It's kind of stuck that way, but it's not necessarily like flexible enough to be able to move back into a neutral position where it can move into pronation the way we really want it to, right? So like, you know, we are seeing plenty of the pronation, but we're overseeing it. You know what I mean? It's kind of stuck that way, and so it's not moving. It's not moving into pronation. It's just kind of getting there once, and then it's stuck there. It's like a car that, you know, you can't drive anymore. It's, you know, I grew up in the sticks in Oregon, and you know, the classic joke about rednecks and having cars in their yard is very true. That thing's been in there, and you know, now it's just a bee's nest. So that's really what we're seeing a lot of times in people who have like a very rigid foot, or you know, limited ankle mobility. So you know, we do want to understand that this is going to cause problems not only when our clients are doing advanced things like running, but also when they're doing things like walking, you know. And then they have the distinction in here in the PowerPoint. There is a difference between walking and running. If you didn't know what it is, Walking is where there's at least one foot in contact with the ground at all times, and running is where there's at least some moment where there is no contact with the ground. So you're basically leaping from foot to foot to foot. So they both put stress on the foot and ankle complex, but they actually should be putting stress in different ways between running and walking. If we look at this picture here, hopefully I can get a good one. It's actually great. So you can kind of see, okay, what is that? You can kind of see the difference between running and walking here, just in this animation. Walking is very much like a heel to toe action. You can kind of see it here, right? They step forward, they put a lot of pressure on the heel and then like drive it through, and then they go to the next one. So walking is kind of a pulling action in a lot of ways, right? Like you step from foot to foot to foot and you sort of pull yourself forward. Whereas running, you actually should be at a little bit of a forward angle and you're kind of staying on the balls of your feet the entire time. You're springing from step to step to step. Jogging is sort of a middle ground, but you think about the last time, you were sitting around your house and your phone rang and it was all the way on the other side of the house and you were probably like barefoot and stuff. You probably went running through the house to get it, right? Or the last time you just think of like, sprinting through your home and you're being very careful because obviously, there's table legs for you to smack your toes on in your house and, things like that. Chances are if you can put yourself there, you're probably imagining yourself kind of tiptoeing, like running on your tiptoes pretty quickly, rather than like bum, like heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe. So there is sort of a distinction there, like between the two. And I tend to be a really big fan of that technique when it comes to running. And, I'm not going to say that it's the only way you should run. I'm not going to, go so far as to say like, it's the only way you should necessarily be running. But I do think that with the invention of the modern running shoe, I kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday, and you can kind of see it here actually. With the modern running shoe, you can see over here, look at how much padding there is on the heel, automatically putting us into plantar flexion, right? Where our foot is sort of planted away. We're in high heels, right? Even in our athletic shoes. And so it encourages, it does two things. It sort of forces us, it makes it harder for us to get the ball of our foot down when we're running, because now like, we're certainly going to land first with our heel because the heel is so much thicker, and then it sort of encourages us to switch our form to that. It switches, and so we see a lot of like heel to toe runners, and we're also seeing an increase in running injuries over the years. And so is there a causation there? I wouldn't go that far, but there's certainly probably a correlation, So, we're starting to see it's getting more popular nowadays. We're seeing this is still padded, but we're starting to see more of a flat difference between like heel and the ball of the foot. This is still like a lot of padding on the shoe, a little bit less here, but you can see, I think that's where, the even more modern running shoes are actually going. And it's because like we are, and then there's this ugly stuff. These are horrible. I am fully against the freaking air bubbles. But we're starting to see like people who are getting like running injuries, and it's likely because like they're running with altered biomechanics. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are meant to run at full speed heel to toe. I think that, if you look at like all of our instincts, we tend to run just on the balls of our feet or a mid-foot strike. And that happens because, the foot's too rigid, right? We kind of get used to being in these modern shoes. So why, I told you guys all day yesterday, I think the most common distortion we see is foot and ankle problems, and the reason why, I think there's a lot of reasons, but one of them very much could be the fact that we just spend a lot of time in shoes, in a very not barefoot stance. Looking at ankle sprains here, let's look at some of the we're going to call it our epidemiology. We're going to talk about like some of the common diseases or injuries sort of associated. We have a lot of diseases to look at in kinesiology. We're just looking at structural stuff, but we definitely have a lot of conditions. We have a lot of like aches and pains that can come along with ankle dysfunction. So the most common ankle dysfunction that you are going to run into, that you're going to see all the time, that you probably have dealt with at some point yourself, actually, are ankle sprains. So ankle sprains, any sprain really, is going to be the stretching or tearing of one of the ligaments. Now in the ankle complex, there's a couple places where this is going to be a little bit more common compared with like others, right? Because you got a lot of ligaments, right? What do we say? There's more than 100 ligaments in your entire foot and ankle complex. So the ankle can get a lot of problems here. If we just Google our ankle ligaments, you can see there are a whole bunch of them. It's going to pull up a lot of pictures of like people spraining their ankles. But you can see here, I'm drawing even in red only because it makes the picture a little easier to see. They did a black and white picture here, but normally we would draw these in white. You can see here's like the posterior one. That's not, that one can get sprained a lot. This one right here and this one right here, your ATL and your CL ligament, these are probably the two most commonly sprained ligaments. And then on the inside, on the medial part towards the inside of your body, you've got what's called your deltoid ligament. This one is very uncommonly sprained, but it theoretically it can happen. But generally it's this guy right here or this guy right here. So those are very, very common. They cause, it's a pretty serious injury, only in the sense, I mean, like everybody kind of comes back from an ankle sprain, but it's a pretty serious injury because it does sort of alter your posture and kind of mess things up for your future. One of the things that they see actually is glute weakness in the same side as whatever ankle you sprain, which makes a lot of sense considering that you're not performing like full hip extension by pressing into the ground when you are propelling yourself. Like when you're walking and you have, an ankle sprain of some type, you're not going to like fully press that leg into the ground. You're going to be a little bit more ginger about it. You're going to walk a little softer. You're going to kind of like limp, right? And so by limping, you are not pressing into the ground. You're not using that muscle. And so that muscle atrophies and loses strength. And then now you have your regular strength glute side on one side, and you have a weaker glute side on the other. So that could cause an asymmetric shift. It can even travel all the way up the kinetic chain. Like the lady who trained me in kinesiology, her master's paper was on how an ankle sprain can actually cause shoulder impingement later in life. And you would not think that those are related, but it travels all the way up the kinetic chain. You end up scoliosising, and then you kind of tilt like this. And that was like her main like thesis, which was pretty cool. And you guys know, luckily I don't make you guys do this, but like most teachers will make you read their thesis. So yeah, it's stretching or tearing of one leg. Now, this is a fun little fact that just comes up all the time. I don't know why NASA is so obsessed with this little factoid, but it is the #1 most common injury in sports. I know we hear about a lot of ACL tears when it comes to we're watching sports and stuff, but as it comes down to it, lateral ankle sprains are the most common injury that we are going to see in the world of sports. It has been shown, like I said, to decrease the neural control of the gluteus medius and the gluteus maximus on that ipsilateral, that same side. So, that is obviously going to cause problems if we're trying to like squat properly. And most of the time, it is caused by excessive inversion. So, like I said, there are different versions of ankle sprains, but most of the time, lateral ankle sprains are going to be the most common. So that is going to be this ligament right here. This is your calcanofibular ligament. And the reason it's called that This is your fibula bone right here. You get your tibia, which is your main shin bone. You've probably smacked that on a grocery cart at some point. And then we've got your fibula, which, you know, that little knob that sticks off on the side of your ankle, that's your fibula, okay? And so this big bone right here, your heel bone, right? And you're able to kind of slam that into the ground. It's pretty loud, right? That's your calcaneus. That's its sort of scientific name. So you get your calcaneus here, you get your fibula here, and the ligament that holds them together is your calcanofibular ligament. So this is the most commonly injured ligament in the world of sports. The rolled ankle, the ankle sprain. I pulled this ligament. Luckily, it wasn't too bad. But literally just before, just before I actually met, let's see here, I get Marjan, we had met before, but like, just before Marjan and George, before you guys joined, I was in a Frisbee tournament a couple weekends ago and stepped into the one hole in the entire field. And sprained this ligament.
Oh, really?
Yep, which is now why like my left foot has been sort of collapsing a little bit more. I'm not fully over it yet. I'm able to like play sports again and like sprint around and around. I played the entire tournament after that. So it wasn't a very severe sprain, but I haven't gone into like fully rehab mode yet. So that is very common injury in sports. I've never sprained my ankle before. That was very much the first time. Lucky for me, it was very, very minor. But let's go ahead and talk about why. So what we see is somebody who will step on their foot like this. They roll their ankle is what you hear people say, right? And so what that does is that overstretches this ligament. Now, here's the thing. You should be able to, this is inversion, right? Remember, we've got eversion where the bottom of the foot shows towards the outside. This is inversion where the bottom of the foot is showing inward, right? So excessive inversion tears this ligament. But here's the thing. We are supposed to be able to do this movement. Like you should be able to stand on the outside of your foot. You should be able to stand on the inside of your foot. It should rotate a little bit. It's just excessive inversion is what caused that tear, right? We pulled too far and we ended up snapping this ligament. Now, why is this so common? Is it just a lot of people are rolling their ankle like all the time? Well, yeah, I mean, kind of, but why is it so common that it tears, right? Like, shouldn't it be able to move through that range of motion? Well, let's take a look at again at our probably most common posture. Like I said, that dysfunction that we normally see, right? So if you look here, you can see this is somebody who's experiencing, call this Pes Planus Syndrome, or we call it pronation distortion syndrome. But you can see, right? They're definitely everting the foot. The bottom of their foot's sort of showing towards the outside, and they've got a little bit of excessive, like this one's a little externally rotated. This one's not doing as much external rotation, but we definitely see it's collapsing inward here, which means this bone has to, kind of go back in the opposite direction. That's going to cause dysfunction there. So there we go, right? This is that excessive, sort of eversion of the foot. So if you're everting your foot all day, right? If this is just your standard, common posture, and you are everting the foot, well, what ends up happening, you can kind of see here, right? In the right side, this eversion, that ligament, which is over here, right? Remember, it's on the lateral side, right? It's on the outside. That ligament is in a shortened state all day, right? So then as you finally maybe roll your ankle like this, which it hopefully should be able to do, we're able to do this motion, but suddenly, like, because this is in a shortened state, just like a shortened overactive muscle, when it gets overstretched, what ends up happening is it tears. So that calcanofibular ligament that we're seeing there, I was hoping for a picture, go back to here, I guess. That calcanofibular ligament, it's in a shortened state all day. So when you do finally try to like roll it, which happens a lot in sports because there's just a lot of lateral movement in sports, it's not ready to be stretched out. because it's used to being in a shortened state. So then what ends up happening is it just tears. You know, we end up losing it at the origin or the insertion, right? And so we get some type of like tear in that ligament. Now, when it comes to ligamentous tears, they're going to look something kind of like this. Actually, that's funny that I just looked up ligament tears in general, and of course, the one they pull up is the ankle, the lateral ankle sprain. They're going to look like this. Chances are what I dealt with was probably just a grade 1 sprain, maybe even a little bit less than that, which is where it's really just a stretch. It kind of got, you know, it's probably got little micro tears in it, nothing really all that serious. Grade 2 is a little bit more serious. This is where you're actually seeing a little bit of like partial damage. Where, you know, there's definitely like a disconnection between some of the fibers, but for the most part, it's still fairly well attached. And then a grade 3 sprain is a complete detachment. So my nephew completely detached his anterior talofibular ligament and his calcanofibular ligament. Now, this thing is meant to literally hold, you know, your fibula onto your foot. Now there's a lot of muscle surrounding the area as well, but my nephew literally detached all of this and walked around for a couple years with it before he finally went and got surgery, and they, you know, sort of reattached it and kind of fixed the whole thing and did like a full ankle repair. But that is, you know, that is something that can happen. I mean, you can, you know, really seriously injure these little ligaments here. So that is our calcanofibular, or just everybody calls it the CL ligament. Like I said, that's the most common injury in the world of sports. There's also your ATL ligament. That's your anterior talofibular ligament. This little bone right here, that is called your talus or your talus. And it is where your tibia actually sits on the top of the ankle. If we look at the talus, you can see it is this bone that sort of props up the entire tibia, right? So again, the tibia is this main shin bone here in your fibula, you know, and then we're attaching this to the calcaneus with that little ligament in the CL, right? Well, the anterior talofibular, right, is attaching your fibula here to your talus. So that's the ligament that we're seeing right here. So that's the calcanofibular. There's the talofibular, and those are probably the biggest bones you need to be familiar with in terms of like memorizing, right? We got our fibula here, tibia there, talus, and calcaneus. Obviously, there's a lot of other bones in the foot, but those are probably the biggest ones that are going to come up because those are where we generally tend to see our dysfunction. So this is like where everything is set. So when you look at like your tail, let's see if I can find a talus motion GIF and find an image of this. When you look at how your ankle actually moves, it works something kind of like this. Come on, give me the swing. No, that's just I don't need a picture of like just the spinning action. I can see the friggin' bone. There we go. So this is what's supposed to happen, right? When you look at like your ankle motion, right? As this person everts and inverts, right? You can see there's a little bit of twisting, right, along that talus, right? But then also during like dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Oh, come on. Oh, I'm trying not to watch a video, so we have to watch an ad, but at this point it's taking me so long, I'm just should just watch the ad. All right. So here's sort of what we're seeing in those bones. Give me the motion, please. There we go. Right. So you can see it's a sliding action. Right now, that was from the bottom. That was somebody moving the ankle, right, rather than moving the shin. But during a squat, it happens in reverse, right? During a squat, the shin comes forward and the ankle is just planted into the floor. It's the same exact motion. It's dorsiflexion, right? Let's see here. Keep moving, trying to see. There we go. So there's that's sort of that action in general, right? And then there's the eversion inversion. So we do see that action there. That is the motion that we're sort of looking for. But again, that motion can be limited if you've torn these ligaments. If you don't have stability to hold these bones the way they're supposed to, what's going to end up happening is the bone will probably slide into an altered position, right? So oftentimes what we'll see is we'll actually see sort of an anterior, call it translation. There's sort of an anterior translation of this bone here. Your tibia will actually sort of slide forward on the talus into a position it's really not supposed to sit in, right? So if we see like anterior translation of the tibia, it will look kind of, oh, they're showing the knee part. Yeah, that does happen though. Into translation, ankle. Looking for a diagram. I'm probably not going to get it. This one's going to be very hard to Google. We are seeing it. I mean, for the record, in all these x-rays here, we're actually seeing a good image of it. But basically, you can kind of see here, this bone has kind of slid into the wrong position, right? You can see, actually, there's a really good one, right? You can see this bone has actually slid forward, right? So now the tibia is kind of hanging off the back here rather than the way it's supposed to, because this ligament probably got torn. So this little talus bone just kind of moved forward there. So that's what would happen sometimes in a high ankle sprain. High ankle sprain can cause dysfunction there. Really the big problem with that, and actually let me ask, anybody in here, when you are squatting, does anybody in here feel a pinching sensation in the front of their ankle? Or when you do a calf stretch, do you feel a pinching in the front of your ankle? Like it feels like the bone's pinching on another bone. Like obviously when you stretch your calves, you feel a stretch in the back of your calves. But does anybody in here feel a pinch?
No,
No,
not me.
not so much. That's good. I mean, I'm happy about it.
So you
but yeah.
mean like when we stretch our calf, like how?
So when you do like a gastrocnemius stretch, right?
Uh-huh.
If you do this one, right, the wall stretch,
Okay.
right? Or if you do like a soleus stretch, especially this one, particularly this one, you'll probably actually feel it. This version here, you get like a pinch here on the front of the foot. Or if you do this version here, you get like a pinch in the front of the foot. So these are soleus stretches, right?
No, I'm good.
Yeah.
I did it.
So that pinching sensation often happens because that talus bone actually slides out of alignment, and it's very highly associated with high ankle sprains. So I would assume most people haven't experienced like a high ankle sprain. By the way, high ankle sprains usually happens a lot to like military folks who are wearing like really tight like combat boots, and then they like roll their ankle around. What ends up happening is like or you see it in football players sometimes who will wear like really just like super laced up shoes. What can happen is like you're basically creating like all this stiffness in both areas, and then when it tries to move, it really can't because it's like locked down in the boot or in the shoe, and then that causes the sort of tear right there. So next very common sort of injury associated with the foot and ankle complex, we are going to see plantar fasciitis. George and we were talking about this a little bit at Sochi yesterday, right? We tend to see a little bit of like tightness in the Achilles tendon. That Achilles tendon wraps around the heel. This picture makes it look like it ends, and then picks up at the plantar fascia. That plantar fascia basically rubs. If we look at our calcanus here, you can see there's this little hook on the bottom. There's this little like ridge here. And so we've got our plantar fascia, which your plantar fascia, plantar for just being the bottom of your foot. Fascia is like I said, it's that connective tissue. It's kind of like muscle. It does have the ability to contract a little bit, but it's not necessarily like as contractile as muscle, and it doesn't get the blood flow that muscle does. So it doesn't repair as quickly. So what ends up happening is this plantar fascia rubs on that little ridge there if you've got those really tight like calf muscles or really weak shin muscles. If we've got some overactivity here where, you know, if we've got some overactivity here where there are just really tight calf muscles, you know, pulling upwards like this, right? And those are overactive. And that's the calves in general. That's the soleus probably mostly, but also the gastrocnemius is going to be really tight there. Well, because of that, we have really weak anterior tibialis muscles, or just tibialis muscles in general. So these muscles are going to be underactive, right? And so that's really something we need to work on if you've got that plantar fascia pain. Yeah, very common. It feels like a stabbing pain most of the time near the heel is what people will describe. And oftentimes it's worse in the morning, or it's worse when you are, if you've been sitting for a little while. So like a lot of times people will sleep and then they'll wake up, and then those first couple steps, if they have plantar fasciitis, are just the worst part of the day. And that's that stabbing sensation. It's because it tends to relax over the night and just tighten up. That is contradictory. It tends to rest during the night, and during that it tends to tighten up. And so like once they kind of get moving and walking it out, the pain usually goes away. Very similar to plantar fasciitis, basically the same problem, just manifesting itself on the other side of the bone, is Achilles tendinopathy or Achilles tendinitis. By the way, just a quick word anatomy lesson here. Anytime you guys hear the word itis, just think inflammation. That's what it is, right? So plantar fasciitis is inflammation of the plantar fascia. Achilles tendinopathy, or Achilles tendinitis, as it's sort of more commonly called, is inflammation of the Achilles tendon. There is like, this is like an unofficial like medical term, but there is actually sort of a difference between an opathy and an itis. But it's like not widely accepted, and they're just used however. But technically Achilles tendinopathy is chronic and Achilles tendinitis is temporary, but they're both the same problem. So, you know, fix it. But usually hear people call it Achilles tendinopathy. Achilles tendinitis, it's the same thing. It's inflammation of this tendon right here. That drives me crazy. I would love to talk to, like, you know, the head doctor in the US. I gotta talk to Dr. Fauci and be like, hey man, can we clear this up, because it's making anatomy lessons complicated. But yeah, difference between an opathy and an itis is honestly just whether or not it's lasted 6 weeks or more, but that doesn't matter. So Achilles tendinitis, inflammation there. We're also going to see, I'm sure everybody in here has dealt with this at some point, you know, temporarily, or at least known somebody who's dealt with it. But yes, question.
I'm sorry. Before we move to another thing, so just want to ask you, like, have you ever happened to you, like your heel really, like when you put in when you're stepping in the ground, your heel is so painful and you can't, like it has like a sharp pain? Or
not me personally, but if you dealt with that, that sounds a little bit like plantar fasciitis. Does it feel like a stabbing, burning sensation?
Yeah, and for like a few seconds you cannot even walk or step down, and then after like few seconds it's gonna release the pain, then you'll be able to walk.
Like you can walk it off, right?
Yeah, walk it off.
And then if you sit down for a little bit, does it come back? Like for
no, when you're sitting down, no. When
No,
you're getting
not when
up.
you're like fully at rest. But let's say you sit, watch a movie for 2 hours, and then you get up, and then that first step after you get up, that's where the pain comes back.
Yeah,
Walk
kind
it
of.
off, and it goes away again.
Yes.
That sounds like plantar fasciitis. That's
So,
the stabbing sensation we're talking about.
okay.
Yeah.
So what?
How do we fix it? We're getting
Yeah.
there. Give me 15 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, we're getting there. So here's the thing. We do need to remember, guys, even though I am talking about all this epidemiology stuff, I am talking about these common injuries. I will say, Mark, give me one asterisk. I have to give you an asterisk here. I'm not allowed to tell you how to treat plantar fasciitis. We don't do that. That's not
Why
our
that happened? Like, why?
Why what?
Why, what's the reason?
Yes. Okay. So that is what we're allowed to do. So here's the distinction. Like as a personal trainer, you guys are getting a corrective exercise certification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Corrective exercise is not the same as physical therapist. So we are very much allowed to improve someone's general fitness, which will often get these aches and pains to go away, or it will at least keep them from coming back. Okay. What we are not allowed to do is diagnose a condition. So you'll notice what I said actually every time. Go back and play the recording. When you were like, I get this pain here, I said that sounds like plantar fasciitis. I definitely did not say, oh, Marjan, you have plantar fasciitis.
Yeah.
That would be me diagnosing you, which I am super not allowed to do because I'm a trainer, not a doctor, right?
Yeah.
So that is one of the distinctions that's very important for us. We don't diagnose medical conditions. We also do not treat medical conditions. Now that sounds a little weird because you're like, well, wait a minute. Somebody hired me. They have diabetes. I worked with them and all of a sudden their diabetes went away, right? Yes, but you didn't treat diabetes. You improved their health through diet and exercise, and their diabetes did go away, right?
Yeah.
That's our approach. We don't necessarily directly attack diseases and conditions. If we did, we would be doctors, right?
Yeah.
What we do is I look at your posture and I see dysfunction. So remember last night we saw your knees cave in and your feet turn out?
Yeah.
That's probably due to the underactive muscles in, your tibial muscles, your shins, and overactivity in your calf muscles. And that stress of moving like this all day instead of moving in alignment all day is probably what is going to cause dysfunction. And you might get something such as like plantar fasciitis. So if we can fix those issues, the plantar fasciitis will likely be relieved. But I never once said I'm going to treat your plantar fasciitis and I'm going to get it. All right. There's a distinction in how we're doing this. I am going to improve your general fitness.
Yes. I think that's what I needed because
here's my favorite way to describe this. I used to say this all the time when I worked at Biggest Loser. This was like my go-to phrase. People would always want to they'd be like, I'm here to lose weight. I'm here to lose weight. And I would say, look, losing weight is a byproduct of an overall healthy lifestyle.
Yeah.
Right. So you live a healthy lifestyle, the weight will come off. You live a functional, active style, the bones will move back into alignment,
Okay.
Sorry, give me 1 second. What is going on outside my window? There's a giant truck causing so much noise. Very concerned. So we are going to look at we are going to sort of talk about the plantar fasciitis here in just a minute. I'm not going to tell you how to treat it because that's not my job and that's not your job. But I will sort of, we're going to look and we're going to see what muscles are commonly dysfunctional and sort of how we can fix that dysfunctional muscle. Which guess what? If your plantar fasciitis goes away, form follows function, right?
Yeah.
We get you back into good form. You're going to function a lot better.
Okay. Thank you.
Last condition, we're going to see medial tibial stress syndrome, which that's super hard to say, medial tibial. This is much more commonly referred to as Shin splints. Probably had this, where you get that just achy pain in the front of your shins. Very common in people who start playing sports. I remember when I first started doing track and field in middle school, I was getting shin splints like crazy. Very commonly seen in runners. Again, this is often due to a weak foot. With a foot that can't support you very well, you end up experiencing a lot of impact. And then there's a lot of fascia. Let me get the, there we go. Yeah, I mean, it works. So you can kind of see, actually, if I look down, that's so pixelated. I'm not seeing the fascia I want to see here. It's, okay. I mean, here this will work just fine, I guess. But you'll have to take my word. Oh, there it is. No, wait. Yeah, sorry. It's over here on the right. So here's like your tibial muscles, right? So this one right here, we're going to be talking a lot about this muscle today. This is your anterior tibialis, okay? And then it's hard to kind of see it, but you've actually got your posterior tibialis behind this bone. It's kind of hanging out right in here. And so if the posterior tibialis muscle isn't working the way it's supposed to be able to, what ends up happening is, see this like white fascia here? This fascia is there to actually tie these two bones together. If you've ever wondered, like, you know, I told you earlier, my nephew completely detached this ligament and this ligament. How the heck did his leg stay on? You know, well, you know, there's skin and muscle and all this other stuff holding it in place. But one thing is that your fibula, this outside bone here, and your tibia, your main shin bone, there's a membrane in there. It's called your it's interosseous membrane, right? And it's this membrane that basically holds, it's like a webbing that kind of holds the whole thing together. His ended up getting very like spread out slowly over time, and it was eventually peeling apart. By the way, you've probably eaten this before if you've ever like had like because this exists in your forearm as well, and it's even between like your ribs and stuff. There's membranes. If you've ever had like ribs and you peeled the ribs apart, you see that, like, you know, silver skin, that fascia. If you ever had like a chicken wing and you peel it apart and there's like a little bit of fascia between the two bones, that's what you're seeing. So that is this is medial tibial stress syndrome, is where this like membrane gets a little overly stretched, and so it actually causes little micro fractures. You'll sometimes see like little stress fractures in this bone because just ripping on the bone rep after rep after rep. Meanwhile, ground reaction forces are punching up. So you end up getting like a little bit of inflammation in there, and all this fascia gets kind of busted up. Generally, fixing that is what sucks about that is it's really just going to take time. You gotta take some time off. You gotta rest and recover until the inflammation goes away and you get some repair going on. Then, in order to keep it from coming back, the shin splints, and this is true of plantar fasciitis as well, you really just need to take some time off. Which, you know, good luck. It's your lower leg. Taking time off is very hard. But then once you do, we need to restore, like, strength in the foot, and we need to sort of work on that mobility. So shin splints, you know, you think about somebody who has limited ankle mobility. If they're not planting in such a way that allows them to sort of cushion their blow, or, you know, plantar fasciitis, if there's just hard impact on that heel, Achilles tendinopathy, if there's just hard impact on that heel, that's where we see it, guys. That's where we start to see this dysfunction. So the answer to your question, Marjan, and probably what everybody's question is, how do we get these problems to go away? We need to restore mobility in the ankle, and we need to restore the strength in the ankle. We can't do that unless we understand what muscles are there. So that's where we are headed. Now, I do need to take a quick little pit stop before we go into these actual muscles here. We start breaking this down. I got to give you, oh, actually, wait, I got to do these bones first. So really quickly, just so you guys are familiar with the bones, like I said, you don't have to get all of these memorized, but, you know, being familiar with them kind of helps you picture where the muscles are at. You have got this first row here, that is known as your phalanges. Anybody in here fan of the show Friends? The blonde lady, she would say like her name was something phalange whenever she was like lying. That's this outer round. Your toes themselves are your phalanges. Your fingers are your phalanges. Okay. Then you've got your metatarsals, which is the bridge of the foot, right? And the bridge of your palm, those are your metacarpals, right? In your foot, we call them the metatarsals. And then we've got this row right here, row D, that's the medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms. Those are your cuboid bones. They are part of the ankle. They are what we call a regular just tarsal. This whole group here is tarsals. Okay, so you have your tarsals, metatarsals, then phalanges, right? You do have a special one here, little E. That's your actual cuboid. It's just called the cuboid, which is funny because you're all cuboids. But that one is like the particular, like it honestly is almost a perfect square. It looks like a dice in a way. Then you've got your talus. That's that bone we talked about earlier. Sort of the navigator bone that kind of sits there. You've got your actual navicular, which lives below the talus and helps it, glide the way it's supposed to. So, and then you can actually see it. This is kind of funny. There's your calcaneus, the heel bone, right? This one, it actually does kind of pop up all the way through to the other side. It comes up here, right? And so you can see there's your calcaneus on the outside, right? Kind of popping through between these two, just like peeking its head into the, it's like the tall kid in the back of the picture. So there's your calcaneus, and then you get your tibia and your fibula. Like I said, guys, the big ones I want you to kind of be a little more familiar with, although memorizing bones is not something NASM really makes you do, is your tibia. It's this one right here. Your fibula, that's one right here, and your talus and calcaneus. Calcaneus being the heel bone, talus being the one that your shin sits on. So this needs to be able to swing in this direction here if we're going to be able to squat properly and move properly. Now, if you're not able to do that, if you have limited dorsiflexion, if your foot can't come this way, because what ends up happening, right? Like I said, this bone sort of moves, it slides out of position, right? So then it ends up pinching as it sort of starts to try to move this way. That is going to cause dysfunction. So we can actually fix that by restoring mobility in the soleus and gastrocnemius and strengthening the anterior and posterior tibialis. Again, we're going to stretch this, we're going to strengthen this. It's just working in opposites. So that's where we're headed. Now, quick pit stop. We are going to sort of do some language stuff here. Now, this is not in your notes, and NASM does, in my opinion, a very poor job of explaining how labeling muscles works. So here's the thing. If you ask any kinesiologist out there what a muscle's function is called, they will call it the muscle's action. Okay, so your gastrocnemius, its action is to accelerate plantar flexion. Points the toe away. My biceps action is to accelerate elbow flexion, right? So that's how we label it. Now, NASM does get a little extra specific, which is kind of nice. They're going to throw one extra word in there. I just said I'm accelerating this, right? I'm accelerating, right? My bicep accelerates elbow flexion. My tricep accelerates elbow extension, right? So both times I use the word accelerate. I sped it up. I moved it, right? Well, that requires a concentric contraction. So NASM's going to say that, okay? They're going to say it concentrically accelerates, and then we're going to describe what the joint movement is. So if it was the gastrocnemius, this muscle right here, right, it would accelerate plantar flexion. It would point the toe away. And the anterior tibialis would accelerate dorsiflexion. It would pull the toe back. This accelerates elbow flexion. This accelerates elbow extension. So it's going to concentrically do that. So NASM's going to say concentrically accelerates, and then it'll describe the joint actions that it does. Okay. Now, NASM doesn't call that the action, which drives me insane. Instead, they call it the isolated function. So when you guys look at your book, you'll see a picture of every one of these muscles in your textbook. If you were flipping through your book at any point and you saw that big list of all the muscles, right? This is what that's going to look like. And so you're going to see them listed with the name, and then it'll say what its isolated function is. Now, here's the thing, guys. You really only need to know the isolated function of your muscles, but you also need to know what the antagonist muscle is. And that way, you know, like one muscle goes this way, the other muscle goes that way, right? So if my anterior tibialis accelerates dorsiflexion and inversion, right? I know that the antagonist to that, the opposite muscle in some ways, is going to be, if I go over to my gastrocnemius, the muscle that accelerates plantar flexion, because plantar flexion is the opposite of dorsiflexion, right? Just like elbow flexion is the opposite of elbow extension. So that's how we're going to speak this language, okay? NASM's going to say the isolated function, which by the way is much more commonly known as the action of the muscle, is whatever the muscle does concentrically. So it's what the muscle does when it's contracting, when it's shortening. The integrated function is whatever the muscle does in the other two actions, right? It's whatever the muscle does eccentrically when it's lengthening, and whatever it does isometrically when it's just stabilizing or holding in place. So if we look at all the jobs of your anterior tibialis, right? Actually, what I'll do is I'll put this in the screenshot here. So if you look at like what this muscle does, right? Its isolated function, right? It's whatever it does concentrically, right? Or when the muscle is shortening. When you think of like what the muscle's job is, right? That is the isolated function, right? Concentric or shortening, okay? And then the integrated function is going to be eccentrically and isometrically, right? So this is concentric, or I'm sorry, eccentric, which means lengthening. You can think of that as relaxing, by the way, right? And then it is also going to be isometric, or stabilizing, you know, and that's what isometric contractions do. They stabilize. So now we look at the anterior tibialis muscle and we see its three jobs, right? It shortens to move the foot into dorsiflexion. It accelerates dorsiflexion. And then it relaxes during plantar flexion. So it decelerates plantar flexion. Or it also just creates some stabilization in the knee and foot complex. So the integrated function is going to be the eccentric and isometric portions of what a muscle does. I wouldn't worry too much about those, guys. If you're trying to memorize this stuff for the first time, I really recommend just paying attention to the isolated function, because you're going to be familiar with what one muscle does on one side of the joint, and you're going to be familiar with its antagonist on the other side of the joint. So you can really just kind of pay attention to those two separate muscles pulling in the opposite directions. So let's go ahead and break this first one down even further. So the anterior tibialis, its job is to accelerate dorsiflexion. When it contracts, it creates dorsiflexion. It also creates ankle inversion. So it does both of these. Whenever your foot is pulling back like this, or whenever you're scooping the inside of your foot towards your midline, right? That is your anterior tibialis doing work, right? So let me take my shoes off here. And I'm going to lose my socks as well, so you guys can actually see this a little bit better. I'm also going to we're going to be switching between screen share and off screen share. So we take a look at what my anterior tibialis does, right? Move it sort of an angle here, right? If I'm letting my foot just kind of hang like this, right? My anterior tibialis is going to contract when I dorsiflex the foot. If I pull my foot from here, which is plantar flexion, to here, which is dorsiflexion, the muscle accelerating that is my anterior tibialis. You'll feel it, by the way. Put your hand here on your shin and then pull your toe up. You'll actually feel that contract, right? So that's the anterior tibialis muscle. Now, it also does inversion, right? It also will pull my foot inward like that, right? So this is eversion. This is inversion, right? Right? Inversion, eversion, inversion, right? So I'm scooping. So if I want to contract that muscle, right, Marjan, we just talked about fixing plantar fasciitis, right? Well, one of the things we can do that'll have a positive effect on it is strengthen the anterior tibialis. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to do an exercise called resisted dorsiflexion. We're going to have a resistance band. It's going to make doing dorsiflexion harder. She's going so fast. You should definitely go slower than this. But see what she's doing? She is pulling her toe back. That's the dorsiflexion, right? So she is working on strengthening her anterior tibialis here. Now, you can also just always, whenever you guys are doing like balance work, if you're doing like a single leg exercise, right? Let's say you're doing like bicep curls, right? And you're doing like single leg curls, right? Or you're just doing bicep curls. Why not do single leg curls? And why not take a second to also dorsiflex the angle? That is going to help, right? That is going to give you a chance to get even better at contracting that. And that's why you see so many, like, I look at demos, right? Single leg exercises. Let's see, I'm just going to Google single side exercises here. I look at this guy, I love it. He's dorsiflexed. He's also happy. This guy's stoked. This guy's also stoked. I look at that and I'm like, that's great. They're using their dorsiflexion, right? Versus here, you can kind of see she's got a little bit of lazy foot. It's not terrible. Like, I get it, like she's focused on balancing here. I get it, right? But why not take the time to also activate this muscle that never gets enough work? Just do a little bit of dorsiflexion. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, there we go, lazy foot, right? Just pull that a little more, right? I know you might be thinking, it's like, well, if I point my toe away, it makes the lever longer and that makes the exercise harder, right? Technically, yes, but it's such a small difference. And this is one of the biggest problems we see. You want to make the exercise harder? Grab a heavier dumbbell, and just flex that darn foot, get that dorsiflexion, right? Plantar flexion here into dorsiflexion. I love that. It's bonus work. You get to work your shins throughout your whole workout, and trust me, everybody needs to work on their freaking shins. All day yesterday, I was like, tight calves, right? Me, tight calves, right? Everybody. So just work on that anterior tibialis muscle whenever you can. So its job is to accelerate dorsiflexion and inversion. Now, it's integrative function, the opposite of what it does. What it does when it's relaxing, when another muscle is contracting, is we're just going to flip all these words around, right? It, instead of concentric, it eccentrically. Instead of accelerating, it decelerates. And instead of dorsiflexion, it's plantar flexion. And instead of inversion, it's eversion. And then it also isometrically stabilizes the foot. So its integrative function is to relax whenever you're using your calf muscle, which does all of this stuff, which we'll see in a second. So that's the anterior tibialis. Questions? How do you guys feel about, reading that language? Does that make sense as to like when we're describing what a muscle does? It's accelerating, it's concentrically shortening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. Anybody else? Cyrus, Julio, Chris, Marjan, you guys feel good about that? This is like, this language stuff is like, if we don't have a good,
trying.
We're gonna be in trouble. What's that, Marjan?
I said, I'm trying.
But do you get, it's what the muscle does when it actively contracts, not when it's relaxing. That's the isolated function.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, stop me if it, I know we're going to get through like a lot of muscles. Today we're only doing, I think, like 6 or 7 muscles. It's not so bad. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 muscles. But it gets bigger and bigger. So we have to know how to kind of talk the talk. And like I said, don't worry too much about the integrative functions. It's not that bad. Okay. Posterior tibialis. So this would be an agonist. Oh, also really quickly, this is the isolated function. Remember, it's concentric. That's when the muscle is the agonist, or at least a synergist, but that's what it does when it's contracting. So we got the posterior tibialis, right? Posterior tibialis, very similar to the anterior tibialis, but is also a little bit of an antagonist in a way. So it accelerates plantar flexion. So because it's on the back, it's the posterior side, you can see here, right? So the back of the heel, right? This actually does the exact opposite of our anterior tibialis. Now, I just got done saying we need to strengthen both our tibialis muscles, but now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, that didn't make any sense. You said we need to get better at dorsiflexion, right? This muscle does plantar flexion. Yeah, it does. Whenever you're using your calves, your gastrocnemius, soleus, and posterior tibialis, all of those muscles point your toe away. But the one thing that your posterior tibialis does that we need way more of is it does the inversion of the foot. Remember how I said we have way too much eversion, right? So many of our clients, excessive eversion, right? We see way too many people scooping their toe out, right? Or they fall even when they're running, right? You ever take a high-speed video of your run, you might notice that you collapse during your run rather than staying neutral. So that is way too much. We're calling it pronation because there's also external rotation there. But it's eversion's a part of this. So we see way too much. Look at all that eversion, right? Look at how sharp of an angle, So that's what we're seeing there. This sort of flat foot posture. Now we talked a little bit about fixing flat-footedness, or trying to get our shin splints to go away, or plantar fasciitis to go away, or Achilles tendinopathy to go away. One of the best things you can do is work on that dorsiflexion with the anterior tibialis, but also we got to look at where the two tibialis muscles work together. They both do inversion, and that is something we don't have enough of. So this is where the anterior tibialis and the posterior tibialis, they're antagonists when it comes to dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, but they are synergists when it comes to inversion. Okay. So posterior tibialis, plantar flexion, anterior tibialis, dorsiflexion, both of them inversion. Okay. And that's why we need to strengthen both these. So if we're trying to do just the anterior tibialis by itself, we would just do resisted dorsiflexion. Right? We would just kind of work on pulling the toe back towards us. And that's going to get our anterior tibialis. But we've also got resisted inversion. So you want to get your posterior tibialis turned on. We are going to resist, and we're going to do a little bit of inversion of the foot. Now, this is a really good version if you are by yourself. You know what? Let me pick up a better one. Let's see here. Posterior. Where's the one I've watched? There we go. I just did not like that demo. Sorry, guys. So you can see here what they're going to do is they're going to relax, and then they're going to contract, and they're going to pull it this way. They're going to relax over here, and they're going to contract over here. The band wants to go this way. So they relax with the band, and then they contract against the band. And what that's going to do is that's going to work both the anterior tibialis again, because getting the inversion, but it's going to work the posterior tibialis's inversion job. We're not really working on the plantar flexion. You can see this person's plantar flexing here, right? We're not really working on that with our posterior tibialis. Most people are already pretty good at that. We are working on relaxing, and then we contract, and we pull it in, right? So those two exercises are really good strengthening techniques that have a very positive impact on shin splints, plantar fasciitis, altered posture just in general, right? And they're really often underactive muscles. So very common muscles that we need to strengthen. Now let's flip over to the bad guy list. Let's flip over to our tight muscles list. If these are our weak muscles, right? Again, we look at that idea of like a muscle imbalance. You know, we look at this like muscle imbalance problem that's so common. Right? I would literally if I were, you know, if I would literally make this list like this, I would say, all right, we got overactive muscles. In this case, we'll put this in red. This is the gastrocnemius. And it's the soleus, right? This is our overactive side over here. And then we'll put a little arrow there, right? Over here. So there's the overactive stuff. And then I would say, oop, I lost somebody. Oop, we lost Marjan. I would say the underactive side would be the anterior tibialis and the posterior tibialis. Both of those muscles not fire in the way we want them to. All right, so they would live here. I put a little arrow up there. My little fake whiteboard here. So yeah, so there's our often tight muscles, and there's our often weak muscles. By the way, I actually need to add one more. Oh, you know, I'll come back to it a bit. So let's look at those freaking calf muscles. Let's break them down. We do need to know their anatomy, because chances are you guys might be out there and be like, well, I want to go my calves, you know. So we are going to see the next muscle. We're going to look at plantar flexion muscles. First one we're going to see is the soleus. So oftentimes you'll hear me say your soleus is like the lower portion of your calf, and your gastrocnemius is the upper portion of your calf. That is a good way to visualize it. I apologize. It's not actually 100% true. Your soleus runs the entire length back here, but it is covered by your gastrocnemius up top. And then it becomes kind of exposed. They kind of start to share some fascia down here at the bottom. So you feel in your soleus at the bottom, and you feel your gastrocnemius up top. If we're being really technical, though, the muscle runs the entire length. It's just underneath the gastrocnemius. So the soleus is considered deep. The gastrocnemius is considered superficial. It's on top, okay? So what does it do? Plantar flexion. Yeah, that's literally its one job. It just points the toes away. So your soleus, oops, sorry. It's in charge of this, you know? That's what it does. If you ever see somebody squat and their heels pop up, right? That is the soleus contracting. The soleus is trying to do way more work than it's supposed to. I gotta make sure she's getting back in here. I'm gonna feel terrible if she doesn't doesn't show up. Okay. Check to see. Yeah, she's not here. Okay, so that's the soleus, right? It literally just concentrically accelerates plantar flexion. You know, it's your jumper muscle, right? It points your toes away, propels you upwards, right? Which means it's integrated function. We flip it around, right? What does it do? It decelerates dorsiflexion. So this muscle is supposed to relax during dorsiflexion, right? When your anterior tibialis is trying to dorsiflex the muscle, trying to dorsiflex the ankle there, your soleus is supposed to let go. But it probably doesn't, you know? So we see limited dorsiflexion, and then that causes somebody to lean too far forward during our squat. This is why yesterday, you know, we held the weight out front, that made the squat easier. We elevated the heels, right? That took the stretch away from the soleus. It didn't have to stretch anymore. So then that made the squat easier for somebody. Now, the synergist that works with your soleus, other than the posterior tibialis, right? That does a little bit of plantar. That does a little bit of plantar flexion as well. But this is probably one of the biggest ones. The other one that's probably a little bit more famous is the gastrocnemius. So your gastrocnemius has two sides to it. Those calf muscles there. If you see somebody with like huge calf muscles, you can even see it pretty easily. You can see the two separate heads kind of separating. Good Lord. So you can see right there's his lateral side and there's his medial side. That's the gastrocnemius. Technically it's one muscle. Technically it's two muscles. Who's right? I don't know. I will say NASM is being a little overly simplistic here when they say that the gastrocnemius accelerates plantar flexion. That is true. However, the lateral side also does a little bit of external rotation, and the medial side does a little bit of internal rotation. So a lot of times we see a client whose feet turn out. That's the lateral aspect of the gastrocnemius. I wish Simon were here, but Cyrus, Chris, you remember yesterday how Simon had like the really tight calves, and I was like, roll that foam roller off to the lateral side of the calf, right? That's because his feet turned out, right? So that's the outside portion. That's often the tight part of the calf, most times. But you know, it could be the whole calf. You know, if they just have like really limited dorsiflexion in general, I would mash this whole area. The gastrocnemius, the soleus, you know, all of it. But if they have like a bad feet turn out situation, it could probably be a little bit more lateral than it is medial. Now, the last one we've got, and this is also a really weird thing your book does, we've got what's called your Peroneus Longus, which is part of your peroneals group. Now, NASM is saying it's the Peroneus Longus here. That's the one that's listed in your book. You actually have a lot of peroneal muscles. If you look at these, you can actually see all of them here. The longus is definitely the one that does most of the work, but look, there's your Peroneus Longus. Your brevis lives underneath it, similar to the calf muscles. And then there's your Peroneus tertius, which actually threads through and comes here. All of those muscles tie, these two tie underneath the fibula, and they grab the foot here. And then this one grabs the foot here. So it pulls on the outside of the foot. So your peroneals group is what I would say is tight. But the only one that's listed in your book is your Peroneus Longus. I don't know why it's like that. But basically, this one does a little bit more plantar flexion. So by the way, remember how I said we have limited dorsiflexion? This makes sense considering that, like, look at this. We got one muscle doing dorsiflexion and then plantar flexion, plantar flexion, plantar flexion, plantar flexion. Like all these, how can it not be underactive? You know, like how is it supposed to keep up? It's 1 versus 5 or 1 versus 4, you know? But the other thing your peroneals do is they do the eversion. So remember how we talked about both the anterior tibialis and the posterior tibialis? They both do inversion, which we don't have enough of. Well, they're working against the peroneals group, and the peroneals group does eversion. So it does a little bit of plantar flexion and it does a little bit of eversion. And that is why this is often very, very tight. So you can see it kind of ties across the top of the foot there. And so when it pulls, I'm going to pull this off share again because it'll be easier to see. Your peroneal muscles pull the foot into, I gotta not move my knee, eversion. See, I'm scooping my foot away, right? Inversion, eversion, inversion, eversion. So most people have very tight peroneals. So I need to add that to our little tight diagram that we've got going here, our overactive, underactive list, right? So there's your peroneals group. I would say that that also falls under our tight category. So if we see a client whose feet turn out, or we see a client whose feet turn out, or if we see like feet flatten, right? Either of those problems, or if we see a little bit of plantar fasciitis, or Achilles Tendinopathy, or Shin Splints, right? We just see a lot of these aches and pains, or like a history of ankle sprains. Actually don't like how I did this. I will worry about that later, especially because I just clicked by mistake. So if we see any of these problems, plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinopathy, shin splints, ankle sprains, we are likely seeing overactivity in the gastrocnemius, that's a plantar flexor, the soleus, that's also a plantar flexor, the peroneals, which is an everter, and we are seeing underactivity in the anterior tibialis, that's a dorsiflexor, the posterior tibialis, that's also a dorsiflexor, and the anterior tibialis and the posterior tibialis are also both inverters. So we have excessive, especially with the feet turn out, eversion and external rotation. And with the feet flattening, we are seeing the same thing. So that's why that is our list of tight muscles. So yesterday, when I was breaking this down at the speed of light, I know it moves kind of fast sometimes if it's your first time seeing this. And I was like, this muscle's tight, this muscle's weak, this muscle's tight. Take a look. NASM has done this work for you. Now, I got to pull up the one that's on the website, but you guys will find this in your textbook. I can't remember. It was like page 391, I think is what I said. Hey, there she is. Let's see here. ASM overhead squat solutions table. This is what's in your book, right? That solutions table, right? Well, take a look, guys. If we're doing the overhead squat and we see our client compensate by their feet turning out, there's our probable overactive muscles list. It's the soleus. It is the probably lateral gastrocnemius. That's the distinction I was giving you. And then now you're going to see the biceps femoris short head here. That's a knee muscle. We'll get to that tomorrow. So I know that's not on our list yet, but there it is, right? There's our tight muscles, just like we built here, right? There's our tight overactive muscles. And then our underactive muscles, the medial gastrocnemius. So we got to use the inside portion of the calf. And then it's going to be the medial hamstring, gracilis sartorius. Now, they actually don't have all those foot muscles mentioned here because they're kind of micro muscles, but I would say definitely work on that posterior tibialis for sure. But you'll see that in your book. You're going to see these muscles show up again. And that's how we use that list that we referenced in class yesterday. So when we pulled up that chart, that's your list of what to stretch and your list of what to strengthen. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions on that before we move on?
Nope, I'm good over here.
All right, cool. I think we've lost Marjan. I think she'll have to be back later. That's a bummer for her. Friggin' Zoom world, man. I get it. You know, we were sitting here yesterday after in between the lessons, and just I don't know if it was the heat or what, but like the whole power in the whole block just boom, like heard like a transformer blow. Ugh. All right. So movements of the ankle. Right, we see dorsiflexion. Again, that's pulling the toe towards you. We see plantar flexion, that's pointing the toe away. We see eversion. That's opening the foot, right? So the muscles in charge of this, right? The dorsiflexion, that's the anterior tibialis. The muscles that are plantar flexion, that's your posterior tibialis, gastrocnemius, and soleus. Over here, we see eversion, right? That muscle, that's showing the bottom of the foot away. And there's inversion showing the bottom of the foot towards, right? The eversion, right? That's going to be your peroneals group. All those muscles working to pull the part of the foot up this way. And then the inversion, that's going to be your anterior plus your posterior tibialis. We also have toe flexion and toe extension. I didn't talk too much about this, but one of the things your peroneals also do is toe extension. And then one of the things your plantar fascia does is toe flexion. We don't actually worry about those. Then we got pronation and supination. Now, pronation and supination are a little bit weird because we're taking some of these other movements and we're putting them together. So pronation is three things happening simultaneously. It's a combination of too much dorsiflexion. So they're putting all the weight on, like, the backside of their foot, their heel. It's excessive eversion. So we are seeing like the eversion showing towards the the foot is everting away, right? They're putting all their weight on the inside ridge here, right? And then we are seeing external rotation, which they're calling abduction here, but they're seeing the toes externally rotate. So that's pronation. And then we see supination is exactly the opposite. Supination is in excessive inversion of the foot. Usually the weight is on the toes, so that's a little bit of plantar flexion, and it's internal rotation. So it's the difference between like it's the difference between like pigeon-toed, right? So this is like, you don't see this that often, but that's internal, right? That is, it does look like the knees are caving in, but see how the toes are coming in like this? That's excessive supination. So that is supination of the foot, internal rotation, inversion actually instead of eversion. And then all the weight's usually on the toes. And then this is what we normally, this is probably the more common, like the Fred Flintstone posture, right? Where like the toes are pointing out, like flattening eversion stuff. So pronation and supination are combo movements. It's all three planes we're seeing dysfunction. So last little bit here. So we just memorized everything by looking at the muscle. And then we talked about what the muscle does, right? Gastrocnemius does plantar flexion. Soleus does plantar flexion, right? We went that way. We went muscle to job. Let's flip it around. I want you to have two ways to memorize this. I'm not sure which version you guys are going to be. Most people tend to be like muscle job. That's how I like to memorize things. Other people, they like to go job muscle. They like to say, I need to know what muscles do plantar flexion. Then they go, it's the gastrocnemius, soleus, posterior tibialis. So this is how we've got it retooled at the other side. So movements of the foot and ankle complex. We've got dorsiflexion. That's movement away. It's movement towards, it's pulling your toes towards your face. You got plantar flexion. It's pointing your toes away from your face. We got eversion. That's showing the foot away from the midline. We got inversion showing the foot towards the midline. We got pronation, which is dorsiflexion, eversion, and external rotation all at once. That's like the foot flattening. And then we got supination, which is plantar flexion, inversion, and internal rotation. That's high arches, right? This is kind of like Simon's feet here, right? We saw a little bit of foot flattening yesterday, and we saw he actually kind of had high arches, which we don't see it very often, actually. So there we go. My dad also has kind of high arches. What muscles do the dorsiflexion? What pulls the source? That's the anterior tibialis. And we will see the peroneals listed here, but really, honestly, the big one, guys, it's just your anterior tibialis. I have the peroneals listed because it's in the PowerPoint and I put it here, but honestly, anterior tibialis. This is the really big one. There are it's a little bit with your peroneals, but trust me, do not spend time working on your peroneals. That will only make your eversion worse because that's their main job. Now, plantar flexion, way bigger list, right? It's going to be your gastrocnemius, it's going to be your soleus, and it's going to be your posterior tibialis. There's also all of the little, like there's some toe muscles in there, like your plantaris and little tiny micro muscles. Don't worry about those. They're all part of like the same complex here. The big ones, gastrocnemius, soleus, posterior tib. We got the inversion. Remember the bottom of the foot towards the midline, right? That's going to be your anterior and your posterior tib. So there's the anterior tib, and then behind it is the posterior tib, right? Both of those invert the foot. So the anterior and posterior, they work opposite of each other in dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, but they work together with inversion. And then when it comes to eversion, rotating the foot towards the outside, those are going to be your peroneals. So, like I said, a lot of times we see too much eversion in our clients. So we need to stretch those peroneals. If you've ever wanted to know, oh God, we lost George now too. My internet must be kicking you guys out like crazy. If you've ever just gave myself a splinter. What is that? Oh no. Speaking of limping, God dang it. If you've ever wanted to know how to stretch your peroneals, remember they're in charge of eversion. So you just need to get into inversion and that will stretch them. However, this is not a very effective stretch, just kind of rolling your ankle out like that. So what you can do is like find something to balance on, like a wall, and then just take your foot behind and drop the bottom of your foot like that. And that can have a really positive effect on that. We're about to wrap this. Oh, there we go. There he is. So eversion, if you want to stretch that peroneal group, like I said, take your foot behind your other foot and like top of your foot down on the ground and just kind of drag it like that. You're doing inversion and plantar flexion. So that actually kind of helps stretch out those peroneal group. And that's a really good stretch for clients who, have the flattened feet. And then there's the toe flexors. These are your flexor hallucis muscles and your flexor digitorum muscles. And then you get a toe extension. That's the extensor muscles. But NASM is not going to ask you about those. They don't really come into play all that often. And that's it, fellas. Yeah, I know it was a lot it got very listy at the end. It's going to be like that. I mean, that's kind of how kinesiology goes, but hopefully you found it fascinating, how it's kind of tied to some injuries and tied to some common movement dysfunctions. But that's about all I got for you. Any questions today, guys? How y'all feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good.
Love that. Glad you get back in at the end. You didn't miss much.
It's getting hot.
Yeah. Julio, Cyrus, Chris, how you guys feeling?
Yeah, let's take it.
Good.
All right. It's listy. Yeah, it's listy. All right, so get your brains to cool down a little bit. Maybe review some of this stuff. Just so you guys know, I am going to send out flashcards of this. It's basically, where did I put that? On my resources? Nope. No, where is it? I'll have to find it. I have every muscle listed in your textbook in one PowerPoint, which is totally the same thing that's in your book. But what's nice about having it as a PowerPoint is you can print it very small, and then you can cut them out to make those flashcards. So I told you about the muscles flashcards, extra credit assignment. Easiest way to do that is to let me print them for you. You cut them out and then glue them onto dollar store flashcards. So I'll be printing those out. The next time we meet up. I'm getting those to you guys. But other than that, I'm gonna let you all go, and I will see you guys tomorrow for the knee complex.
All right, sir. Have a good day. Thank you.
All right, see you later, guys. Where's my, there it is.